thousands of years. This place was discovered by cavers in 1994 and then closed off to the public immediately.
On the 18th of December, 1994, 3 cavers exploring the limestone gorges of the Ardèche in southeastern France felt a faint draft of air slipping through a crack in the rock. Jean-Marie Chauvet, Eliette Brunel-Deschamps, and Christian Hilaire were not scientists, but they knew moving air meant open space behind the stone. They squeezed through and dropped into a chamber no living thing had entered since the last ice age, and the cave would take Chauvet's name, even though 2 others stood right beside him. A rockfall had sealed it shut for more than 20,000 years, and the paintings on its walls turned out to be around 30,000 years old, already ancient by the time the mountain closed the door. They were not the crude marks anyone expected from that far back. They were so advanced, they forced scientists to rewrite the story of when human creativity began. Before we get into it, if you find these stories worth telling, take a second to subscribe. To understand why this cave rewrote so much, you have to start where the researchers did, with what was actually waiting on those walls once they got inside. What was inside? Once researchers began mapping the interior, they realized the cave was far larger than the entrance had ever suggested. It runs back through the limestone as a system of connected chambers stretching roughly 1,300 feet into the rock. And when they counted what covered the walls, the number was staggering. More than 1,000 separate images, some painted on, and some cut straight into the stone as engravings. It should not have been possible for that much to survive in one place, but it had, and every image was still there to be catalogued. It was not just the number that stopped them. It was what the animals were. Most prehistoric cave art from this period leans on the calm, familiar creatures that people hunted for food, animals like horses and reindeer. But the walls of Chauvet are crowded with predators instead. There are cave lions drawn in profile, cave bears, hyenas, and rhinoceroses. And in one spot, the faint shape of a leopard traced onto the rock, an animal so rarely drawn that its outline here is one of the few of its kind known from the ancient world. These are the dangerous animals, the ones that almost never appear this often in art from anywhere else in this era. That choice of subject was strange enough on its own, but the way the art was arranged made it stranger. The most striking stretches of wall have names now. Researchers call them panels, meaning a single large surface of rock that the artists treated as one composition, the way a modern artist treats a canvas. There is the horse panel, and deeper in the furthest gallery, there is the great panel of lions and rhinoceroses, a sweeping wall where the artists did not draw single animals in isolation, but whole scenes. Lions move together as a hunting group. Rhinos lock horns as if caught in the middle of a fight. That alone set the cave apart, because scenes like this, animals shown reacting to one another rather than floating alone on bare rock, were thought to belong to a far later stage of human art. And the walls were only half of it. The floor held its own record, and in places it was just as untouched as the paintings above it. The soft clay still holds the paw prints of cave bears that once lived and slept in these chambers, along with the shallow dips in the ground where those bears had settled down to rest. Bones lie scattered everywhere the light falls, bear skulls among them, and the curved horn of an ibex. In one place, a single bear skull had been set on top of a block of stone, resting there on its own, as if it had been deliberately placed rather than simply dropped. There was something more human in the clay too. Pressed into the soft ground were footprints, including a set left by a child, some of the oldest human footprints anywhere that can be reliably dated, sitting exactly where they were made and undisturbed across all the time that followed. Then there were the hands. Scattered through the chambers are handprints made in red ochre, a natural earth pigment, a clay colored by iron that early humans used as paint. Some were pressed solid against the rock. Others were left as stencils, made by holding a hand flat to the wall and blowing pigment around it, so that when the hand was lifted away, its shape stayed behind in negative, the outline filled with color, and the hand itself left blank. If this had been ordinary work for its age, it would have looked crude. The rough marks of people only beginning to understand what a wall could hold. But it did not look crude at all. The shading was controlled. The perspective was deliberate. The sense of weight and motion was already there, and therefore the problem was obvious to anyone standing in front of it. The accepted timeline of when humans first learned to make art like this was already coming apart. And the only way to prove how far apart was to find out exactly how old these paintings really were. Radiocarbon dating. Working out how old the paintings were became the next big challenge, and it turned out to be harder than it sounds, because the normal way of aging a cave painting simply did not work here. For most of the 20th century, researchers dated cave art by its style. They judged how advanced a painting looked and placed it on a timeline based on that, with cruder work assumed to be older and finer work assumed to be younger. But Chauvet's art looked far too advanced for the age it turned out to be, so judging it by style would have given the wrong answer entirely. The only way forward was to test the physical material the paintings were made from. That is where radiocarbon dating came in. It is a method that works on anything that was once alive, and it measures a particular form of carbon that begins to break down at a steady, predictable rate the moment a living thing dies. By measuring how much of that carbon is left in a sample, scientists can work out how long ago it stopped living, which gives a reliable age. And Chauvet happened to be full of material that fit the method perfectly. The reason is in the paintings themselves. Many of the images were drawn in charcoal, and charcoal is simply burnt wood, which means it was once a living tree, exactly the once living material radiocarbon dating can read. So the black drawings could be tested directly. Researchers took tiny samples of that charcoal straight from the walls, along with charcoal left by the torches the artists carried. The dark scorch marks their flames burned onto the rock as they moved through the dark, plus bone from the cave floor, and sent all of it away to be dated. The first numbers came back so old they were hard to believe. By the early 2010s, more than 80 separate radiocarbon dates had been gathered from the site, and a later study pushed the total past 250 samples. Out of all that data, a clear pattern emerged. People had used the cave in two distinct stretches of time, an earlier one running from roughly 37,000 to 33,000 years ago, and a later one from about 31,000 to 28,000 years ago. Almost every black drawing belonged to that earlier stretch. Then the dates were sharpened even further. In 2020, scientists reran the oldest results using an upgraded version of the carbon dating scale, a more accurate reference chart that corrects small errors in the raw numbers, and the oldest painting in the cave came out at around 36,500 years old. That single number changed the whole map of human art. It placed Chauvet thousands of years ahead of Lascaux, the famous painted cave in central France that had long been treated as the high point of ancient art, the benchmark everything else was measured against. Now here was a cave far older and in many ways far more skilled, sitting near the very beginning of the timeline instead of its peak. That should have settled it. But a discovery this far out of line does not get accepted quietly. And instead of ending the debate, these numbers started a fight, one that would take years and an entirely different branch of science to finally put to rest. The dating war and the seal that settled it. The problem was that the numbers broke a rule everyone in the field had trusted for decades. Art this refined was supposed to come late. So when the dates said Chauvet was among the oldest painted caves on Earth, a number of archaeologists pushed back hard. They argued that the style pointed to a much later period and that the paintings might really be only 12 to 17,000 years old, far younger than the charcoal was suggesting. In their view, something had to be wrong with the samples because the alternative meant rewriting the story of when humans became capable of art like this. The first answer to that doubt came from inside the cave itself. On some parts of the wall, the artists had carved lines into the rock right on top of the existing black paintings. That order cannot be faked, because you can only carve over a painting that is already there. So the painting had to come first, and the carving second, which meant the paintings were clearly the older of the two. And since those carvings belonged to a later period everyone already accepted, the paintings underneath them had to be older still, quietly knocking down the claim that the art was too young. But the argument that truly ended the debate did not come from studying the art at all. It came from studying the rock at the entrance, using a completely separate method that had nothing to do with carbon. In 2012, a team examined the collapsed stone at the cave's only entrance using a technique that measures how long a rock surface has been exposed to the sky, based on a form of chlorine that builds up in stone once it is uncovered and hit by cosmic rays from space. By reading that buildup, they could work out when the cliff above the entrance had fallen and closed the cave off. What they found lined up with everything the charcoal had said. The cliff had collapsed in stages, beginning around 29,000 years ago, and a final rockfall sealed the entrance completely about 21,500 years ago. That was the decisive point. If the entrance had been buried and shut for more than 20,000 years, then every painting inside had to be older than that seal. There was no way for anyone to have entered later to make them. The art could not possibly be 12 to 17,000 years old, because for all that time, there was no way in. And that is what made the result so hard to argue with. The age was now proven twice over, once by the carbon in the charcoal and once by the geology of the collapsed cliff. Two methods that had nothing in common arriving at the same answer. Dating by style alone, the old habit that had misjudged Chauvet from the start was finished as a reliable tool. And buried inside that result was a detail stranger than the argument it settled. The seal was younger than the paintings, which means that for thousands of years before the mountain ever closed, the art on those walls was already ancient, staring out at anyone who wandered in long after the last artist had gone. Before we get to the part that actually rewrote human history, take a second to subscribe. Why it shouldn't exist. Here is what made all of this more than a dating dispute. Once the age was locked down, the meaning of it landed with full weight, because it broke the single biggest assumption people had ever held about early humans. For a long time, the picture ran in a straight line, with our distant ancestors starting out making crude scratches and clumsy marks, and only over tens of thousands of years slowly working their way up to real skill, one generation improving a little on the last until art gradually crawled forward toward something impressive. Chauvet did not fit that line at all, and it did not fit it in the most jarring way possible, because the oldest paintings in the cave are among the most skilled in the entire prehistoric record. The art at the very beginning was already better than art that came long after it. And the skill is not a matter of opinion, because it shows plainly in the technique the artists used. In many places, they scraped the wall clean before they began, clearing away loose rock so the surface was smooth and their images would stand out sharper against it. They cut fine outlines around certain animals so the figures seemed to lift off the rock and take on real depth. And rather than fight the uneven wall, they used its shape to their advantage, letting a natural bulge in the stone become the muscle of a shoulder or the curve of an animal's side. So the rock itself gave the painting a three-dimensional feel. There was even movement in it. On some panels, an animal was drawn with slightly shifted extra lines, a doubled head, or an added set of legs, so that under a moving torch flame, the figure looked as if it were stepping forward. An early trick of motion made tens of thousands of years before anyone thought such a thing was possible. None of that belongs to a beginner. It is the work of people who already understood their craft deeply, who had clearly inherited technique, which means the tradition behind these walls stretched back even further than the paintings themselves. The problem is clear once you put it plainly. The very first advanced art we can find is not simple at all. It arrives almost fully formed, which suggests the human capacity for it was there long before, waiting in minds we had assumed were still primitive. And that reaches past art into something deeper. The ability to stand in a dark cave and turn a blank wall into a living animal is the mark of a particular mind. A mind that can imagine something and hold on to an idea even when the thing itself is nowhere in sight. Finding that ability at Chauvet pushed the evidence for the fully modern human mind thousands of years earlier than the timeline allowed. These were people living through the depths of the last ice age, surviving among dangerous animals, and still they carried the imagination to make this. What sharpens it even more is who else has walked this same continent. Chauvet's artists were not the only humans Europe had known. Neanderthals, a separate and older human species, had lived across these lands for a very long time, sharing the continent with early modern humans through part of that stretch before fading out of the picture. Yet for all the time Neanderthals spent in Europe, nothing they left behind quite matches what covers these walls. Two humans moved across the same cold landscape, and only one of them reached into a cave like this and turned bare rock into a herd of living animals. Chauvet did not simply shift a few dates around. It changed the answer to a much larger question, the question of when the human mind first became capable of imagination and art at all. The seal as accidental preservation. There is one more strange thing about Chauvet, and it might be the strangest of all. By every reasonable expectation, none of this art should still be here to argue about. The fact that scientists were able to date these paintings at all is its own small miracle, because in almost any other circumstance, there would have been nothing left on the walls to test. Paintings simply do not survive 30,000 years under normal conditions. Damp works its way in and lifts the color off the stone. Shifts in temperature crack the surface, and moving air carries the mold and bacteria that slowly eat away at anything the artists left behind, while animals passing through rub against the walls or trample what remains. Give a painted cave enough time exposed to the open world, and the wall eventually goes blank. Yet at Chauvet, the images look almost fresh, as though the artists had set down their tools a few years ago rather than before the end of the last ice age. The reason is the same disaster that closed the debate over its age. When that final rockfall buried the entrance, it did not just lock people out. It sealed the whole cave into a stillness that almost never exists in nature, shutting out the rain and the animals that would have worn the art down over time. The temperature and the moisture inside went quiet and stayed quiet, holding nearly steady for thousands of years while the weather kept churning just a few feet away on the other side of the rock. That long, unbroken calm is what lets the art survive in the condition it did, and it is almost impossible to find anywhere else on Earth. To understand how rare that gift really is, you only have to look at what happened to another famous painted cave in France. Lascaux was discovered in 1940, and unlike Chauvet, it was opened to the public. Visitors came in their thousands, year after year, and it turned out that people themselves were the threat, because everything a human body brings into a sealed cave works against the art. The warmth people gave off, and the moisture in their breath, combined with the bright lights installed so they could see, slowly threw the cave's delicate balance out of order. and once that balance tipped, the damage came quickly. A green film of algae began creeping across the walls, and patches of mold and crystal spread over paintings that had lasted tens of thousands of years untouched, until the harm was undeniable and the cave had to be shut. Even now, decades later, specialists are still fighting to hold back the decay that a few short years of visitors set loose. So the lesson wrote itself. The one thing that had kept Chauvet perfect was that no human had ever been able to reach it. And the moment humans finally could, the danger began. That single realization led to the most unexpected turn in the entire story. The people who had just uncovered the most important painted cave on Earth took one look at what they were holding and decided the safest thing they could do was close it back up and keep almost everyone out. The cave, almost no one can enter, and that decision has held ever since. Chauvet has been closed to the public since 1994, the very year it was discovered, and it remains one of the most tightly guarded places on the planet. The way in is not a path or an open mouth in the cliff, but a heavy steel door set into the rock. And behind it sit several locks, one of which will only open for a specific person's body, a fingerprint or similar scan, so that just a small handful of trusted conservators are physically able to get inside. But being allowed through the door is only the beginning of the restrictions, because even the few who are let in are controlled down to the smallest detail. Only around 200 researchers and conservators are permitted inside across an entire year, and they go in wearing protective gear, moving along narrow metal walkways raised above the cave floor so their feet never touch the ground the Ice Age left behind. They are told not to touch anything, to keep their visits short, and to disturb the air as little as they can, because the entire goal is to hold the conditions inside exactly as steady as the rockfall kept them for 20,000 years. The scale of that exclusion is hard to picture until you set it against something else. More people have stood on the summit of Mount Everest than have ever set foot inside this cave. It sounds impossible because Everest kills people who try, but the math holds. Everest has taken hundreds of new climbers to the top every year for decades, pushing the total into the thousands, while Chauvet lets in the same small circle of specialists over and over, so its number barely moves. The deadliest peak on Earth has been reached by more human beings than a cave sitting quietly inside a French hillside. So the most important art in the human story now sits in permanent darkness, kept alive precisely because almost no living person is allowed to look at it. Which raises an obvious problem. If the real cave can never open, how is anyone outside that tiny circle ever meant to see what is inside it? Caverne du Pont-d'Arc, France found a way around the problem that was as bold as it was odd. If people could not be let into the real cave, then a second Chauvet would be created for them instead. An exact copy they could walk through freely without ever putting the original at risk. A few miles from the true site, engineers and artists set out to construct a full-scale replica of the cave, an artificial version that reproduces the chambers and the paintings in careful detail. And in 2015, it opened to the public as the Caverne du Pont-d'Arc. The work behind it was enormous. The project cost somewhere around 55 million euros, took roughly 8 years from start to finish, and pulled in hundreds of people to complete. To get the shape of the cave right, teams first scanned every surface of the original with lasers and built detailed three-dimensional models of the interior, capturing the exact contours of the walls the Ice Age artists had worked on. Those scans became the blueprint for a cave that never existed in nature, but would match one that did, down to the curve of the rock. With the plans in hand, the actual building could begin, and it meant recreating solid stone from artificial materials. The limestone walls were remade in concrete, shaped over a steel framework, so the artificial chambers held the same forms as the real ones. The rock formations were rebuilt too, both the stalactites, the stone spikes that hang down from a cave ceiling, and the stalagmites, the ones that rise up from the floor, all recreated in resin to match the originals. Even the air was copied, with the temperature inside set to match the cool, damp conditions of the true cave, so that stepping into the replica would feel, as closely as possible, like stepping into the sealed original. The paintings themselves were the hardest part, and the solution was painstaking. Rather than work inside the finished replica, artists recreated the images off-site, projecting high-resolution photographs of the real paintings onto blank panels of manufactured rock and copying them by hand, matching every bump and groove of the original surface so the final images would sit on the fake wall exactly as they sat on the true one. The finished result is the largest cave replica ever built, letting millions of people finally stand in front of Chauvet's art, or at least the closest thing to it that anyone outside that small circle will ever see. For more than 20,000 years, fallen rock kept this cave sealed, and behind it waited paintings 30,000 years old, art so advanced it should not have existed that early. It was found by accident and then closed again on purpose, so that what a rockfall saved would not be lost the moment we reached it. If this pulled you in, subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments whether a cave this rare should ever be opened to the world.